I'm going to talk about a sort of practical application of using persistent identifiers to solve a problem that we're facing. I'll start off with this quote from the University of Cambridge Office of Scholarly Communications. "We are drowning in compliance." Their situation is far from unique. Ask any librarian or research administrator tasked with the duty of keeping an institution's researchers compliant with funding agency, institutional and governmental policies, and you'll hear the same thing. And it's also true for journal editors and for publishers. Our job is to serve the needs of our readers and our authors who are under an increasingly enormous compliance burden. As of last week, RoarMap now lists 768. This slide is continuously obsolete. Every time I make it, they add a few more. 768 national funding agency organizational and institutional policies towards providing public access to research papers. Every policy is a little bit different. They have variable requirements. And because research is increasingly collaborative, most papers have multiple authors with multiple sources of funding from multiple institutions and often multiple countries of origin. So if you take the number 768 and you plug it into your calculator and say what are the possible number of permutations of that, of combinatorials, you get an error message because the number is too close to infinity for your calculator to figure out. So that creates a lot of big challenges. If you're a funding agency, you probably have a good reason behind your policy. You want it followed. That means you have to spend money, you have to spend effort to monitor your grant recipients and to make sure they're complying, and then you have to enforce the policy, restrict their funds basically if they're not. If you're a researcher, you probably have a lot of different policies. Some of them are complementary, some of them are contradictory that any given paper falls under for yourself. Not to mention your co-authors and their policies and the people you share a grant with. This is something that was raised to me recently of often you'll have multiple people on a grant, so you don't have to track your own papers, you have to track the papers of the other people on your grant, because if they aren't compliant in their papers, then you can lose your funding as well. You have to make sure all the necessary hoops have been jumped through if you want to keep your funding, basically. And despite this, in a fairly recent poll, more than half of the researchers asked did not know their funding agency's access policy. For a publisher or a research administrator who wants to take care of authors, make sure they're all compliant, everybody gets to keep their funding, infinity is a really big number to track. A recent survey of academic libraries found that an average of slightly over 4 library employees devoted at least 10% of their time to open access initiatives. In its first year, the RC UK, Research Council UK open access policy saw a staggering amount of administrative costs for a fairly low level of compliance. Without careful monitoring and enforcement, a policy, even a mandate, becomes an empty promise. We know that researchers are overburdened, they're short on time. Basically anything they don't have to do, they won't do. When people come up with goals and create these new rules to achieve these goals, they very often they give very little thought to compliance, and you either end up with a policy that's toothless and ignored or a policy that's followed but at great expense and great effort. I think the NIH's public access policy is a great example, and it's particularly informative because it's been around, it's been in place a lot longer than most of these other newer policies, and it's really had a chance to evolve over time to become more effective. When it was first launched, it was entirely voluntary for funded authors, and compliance was minuscule. Basically, nobody bothered because they didn't have to. It wasn't until the NIH made the policy mandatory and then started penalizing researchers who didn't comply, either by cutting off their funding or making them ineligible for future funding, that compliance started to pick up. The other smart thing that the NIH did was to really drive the success of PubMed Central is that they worked out ways of automating compliance, or at least taking the burden of compliance off of the authors and the researchers themselves. Nearly half of what comes into the PubMed Central from NIH-funded authors doesn't come from the authors themselves. It comes from publishers depositing on behalf of authors. Recently, the ACS changed their policy of automatically depositing on behalf of authors to only doing that for authors who paid an open access charge, and left other authors to deposit on their own. And the numbers show that when compliance is left to researchers, it basically drops from over 90% to around 50%. So we know that automation is really the key to effective policy compliance. The problem that we're facing now is the approaches we have in place don't scale. We can, we can't really hand identify papers from every funder and every institution that are out there. Basically, there's a really big difference between just dealing with the NIH's policy or a handful of policies and dealing with those combinations of 768 policies. So, how do we deal with scale? Just like every sort of other aspect of our life, as complexity increases, we turn to the sorts of approaches that we use to handle big data sets. We can no longer handle compliance by hand, so we need alternative ways to process it. And the way we're doing this is through persistent identifiers. We've talked about a lot of these today. I'm not going to go too deeply into them. DOI is key. It's been around since 2000. Basically, the DOI for an article remains fixed over time. It identifies a digital object, in this case the article. Even if the location of that object moves, you can always find it through the DOI. If the journal moves from Elsevier to Wiley, we can still find that article through the DOI. So that gives us a permanent identifier for the article itself. We can plug that into our system for automating compliance. So what else do we need to know? We need to know who wrote the article. We need to identify the authors, and for that, increasingly, we have ORCID. And as a bit of an editorial pedant, I never know whether to say ORCID ID. Is that like saying ATM machine? I'm still waiting for the right nomenclature on that. But the ORCID ID creates a unique identifier for each individual researcher, and so okay, now we can spot the individuals behind the paper, so we can try to meet their compliance needs. Well, what are those needs? For that, we use what used to be called FundRef. It's now the Crossref Open Funder Registry. Lists more than 11,500 unique funding agencies. So we can now associate the paper with its funders to know what requirements have been placed upon it. And the combination of those three things gives us our basic system that works. And to make things really more effective, we could use some more information. Christine talked about institutional identifiers. There's a lot of competition right now in that market. It hasn't really coalesced around one standard yet, but hopefully that'll happen soon. But that'll tell us, is this paper, was the research done at the University of York in England, York University in Toronto, or York College in Pennsylvania? There's also a tremendous amount of development going on for licensing identifiers. Is this work under copyright? Is it an open access paper under a Creative Commons license? Is this the published version of record? Is this a preprint version? Is this the author's accepted manuscript? Every identifier here provides more data to make our system more effective. So in practice, here's an example. Chorus, so the United States federal funding agencies that spend more than $100 million annually in funding research require authors to make a version of their article describing funded research publicly accessible within 12 months of publication. 6 of those agencies and a few more that are in active discussions have partnered with publishers to use a system called Chorus, Clearinghouse for the Open Research of the United States. I always like to point out that the group behind Chorus, the not-for-profit, is called CORE, with US being our first project. We expect to launch our first trial with an international funder, hopefully later this year. But the essential idea behind Chorus was to take all this infrastructure that we've already built and put it to use for public access rather than making these funding agencies build their own expensive systems, potentially taking money away from funding research. Let's see, I've got a page missing here. And, there it is. So how Chorus works, the idea is basically the author comes in, they submit their paper, and in the course of that, they identify who are the funding sources behind this paper. This is built into the major article submission systems that are generally in use. And what happens is this adds a funder tag to the article's metadata, and then using that tag, the article is made freely accessible in the journal at the appropriate time based on that particular funder's requirements. And so no manual intervention by the author publisher is required. So my managing editors don't have to go in and dig out and say, all right, who funded this? All right, what are their rules? All right, then we have to set this one to do it. It gets taken care of. The tags are also useful. They drive discovery. So at Chorus, we've built some of our own search tools as examples, but probably more importantly, we have an open API where anyone can tap into this data and use this to enhance their own search and discovery tools. At the same time, a copy of the paper is permanently archived, so if for some reason in the future the free version of in the journal is unavailable, the archived version comes to light, and that ensures that public access is always maintained. Compliance is the really big issue I'm talking about. So we are building these sort of dashboard tools for member publishers and for funding agencies, and that gives this sort of at-a-glance way to track compliance. A funder can drill down to see which articles have been published that list its funding. When are they supposed to become freely available? Are they actually freely available? We're going to launch very soon a really interesting pilot to work with a couple of university libraries to build similar tools from them. What is the research output from this university in terms of paper? Where are they published? Who funded it? What rules are they under? Are they actually compliant? The idea is to try and make these tools that makes that burden on the research administrator, on the librarian, a lot easier, an easier way to actually see what's going on and to track it. This is another out-of-date slide. This is from April. We're already tracking over 200,000 papers, and nearly 50,000 of them are already freely available, which is good, given that most of these policies just went into effect at the beginning of 2016. A lot of our Chorus members are in some state of implementation now, so OUP just went live with Chorus on all our journals in mid-March, so basically papers that were accepted or submitted in March are going through the peer review process, and as they're published, they'll be added to these totals as well. So I expect to see this chart continue to rise. This gives you a sense of the members of Chorus. If you're working for a publisher and you're not a member yet and you want more information, Howard Ratner, who's our CEO, is here at the meeting. You can talk to me. Susan Spilka is here as well. Come find us and talk to us, or you can get more information at our website, chorusaccess.org. And just as a call to arms, again, you're hearing from a lot of different sources how important these persistent identifiers are. If you're not actively building them into your systems, get moving. So, thanks.